Welcome to episode 501. Today we break down the intent and possible side effects of Florida's controversial Don't Say Gay law. And what does Disney's response to the controversy tell us about where the wider culture is heading? Then I talk with the president of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, Reverend Dr. Gabriel Salguero, about the growing influence of Latinos within American evangelicalism. All of that, plus an example of Christian nationalism in the wild and new animal news. Before we start the show, a quick reminder that we've launched a brand new Holy Post book club with our partners at InterVarsity Press. If you are a Patreon supporter, you can sign up to get a free copy every quarter of either an ebook or a hard copy of a book that we've selected especially for the Holy Post audience. We're going to interview each book's author once a quarter, perhaps have an interaction with them online, read the book together, and have discussions on Patreon and other platforms, and perhaps even our monthly live chats on YouTube. So if you'd like to participate in the book club, now's your chance to sign up and become a Patreon supporter. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, first of all, thank you, but you can change your support level to make sure you get the book in the format that you want. So be sure to go to holypost.com and click the Support Us button to learn more about our Patreon support teams and the book club. Okay, here's episode 501.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is Phil Vischer. You're listening to the Holy Post podcast, episode number 501.
Yes, it is.
Woo!
Woo-hoo.
What are we doing?
Era.
What are we doing special for 501?
You're going to sing for us?
Start.
Yeah. I'm here with Skye Jatani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
And Christian Taylor coming from the inside of a tangerine. Hi, Christian Taylor.
Hi, Phil.
Is that orange or red? I'm not sure.
It is orange. It's actually a lot of orange in here.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Christian's in her new home recording booth because she's a voiceover actress, and it is orange.
Yeah.
Muy bueno. And Skye is we'll say it's dark blue. I'm going to say dark blue. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Thank you.
It's not Death Star. It's Death Star adjacent. I'll say that. But it's more of a stylish Death Star. And here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Jason's not here. He was busy with something else. So we have no Jason to have fun with. We have no laugh track. It means we have no laugh track.
So I know that's kind of sad.
I'll have to step up my laughter.
Yeah. Find everything that Skye and I say very amusing. Okay.
All righty.
Yeah. See, you're off to a good start. Skye, what have you been up to? And you married somebody.
Well, I've been married for a long time.
You married somebody.
Yes, we went down to Texas for my brother-in-law's wedding that I had the honor to officiate. So it was a big, full family wedding weekend.
And was it fun?
It was.
Is fun a descriptor you might use?
Yes, it was fun. It was a beautiful wedding, and the weather could not have been better. And it was kind of outdoors. At least the ceremony was outdoors, which I've done a few of those, and they always make me very nervous as a bald American. Because when the pastor's up there sweating profusely with nothing to stop it isn't like I can wear a headband.
Right.
That would be not funny, attractive, though. But it was really, really, really nice. So grateful to do that.
So is doing weddings kind of like riding a bike, no matter how long it's been, you could just fall back into it. No, this was easy.
No, in fact, this is going to sound silly, but it's one of the harder things I had to do as a pastor that I was most nervous about. And it still is because, well, I mean, most weddings, there's just a lot of emotion and tension and family dynamics. And even when it's not my family, like this was a family wedding, which is different. It's more enjoyable on a certain level, but it's, you're just stepping into that as a pastor. And so that's pretty tense. And then there's that fear, like if you misspeak in a sermon, it's like, okay, who cares? No big whip. If you misspeak at a wedding, people tend to remember those kinds of things, like saying the wrong name or something terrible like that.
Yeah. Right. So did you?
No. Everything went off without a hitch. It was really nice. So,
okay. Did you dance?
But I really don't.
Was there a dance?
What's that?
Was there a dance?
Oh yeah. There was dancing. and frivolities.
Were you dancing?
I danced a little, but not a ton.
I would have loved to have been there for that.
And what? Yeah, but I don't do weddings anymore except for family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no one email me and say, "Will you please do my wedding?" I'm not going to.
Yeah.
He won't even answer your email.
We need to talk about some animal news. Animal news, Christian. You like animal news, right?
I love animal news.
Yeah.
What is it today?
And this is animal news that I think has theological implications. Not all animal news has theological implications, but I think this does. There was a break-in at a church in Alabama. Okay? A break-in. Smashed the glass doors, broke into the church.
Wow.
This is in Autauga County, Alabama. The sheriffs showed up to see, found the doors smashed, glass doors smashed, went inside, guns ready to see what was up, and found 2 goats in the kitchen.
Wow.
2 goats got out of their pen nearby, and this is where it gets interesting. And what did they decide to do? They decided to break into the nearest church. Physically.
Could they smell? Was something rotten in the kitchen?
I don't know. All I can think of is that the goats are sick of how they're portrayed in the New Testament.
That's a good one, Phil.
Yeah.
Breaking and entering is not helping their reputation.
It's revenge. It's revenge. Oh, you want to see the goats be the goats. We'll show you the goats being the goats. And just so you know how different it is in sheriff's offices in rural Alabama, the sheriff's office posted on their Facebook page, apparently goats need Jesus too. So I don't know that you'd see that in Chicago or New York or LA from the sheriff's office. So Skye, sermon illustration. What do you make of it?
Sometimes it's the goats or the most sinful people who are looking for Jesus, and it's the sheep who are wandering away from him.
Yeah.
You are so
good.
quick with the deep theological implications.
We need to remove barriers to goats entering the church. How about that?
Yes, like glass doors.
Yeah.
Yes. Open
and
the
ceilings.
doors wide, let the goats come in. In related news, a flock of sheep was found breaking into a strip club. No, that's not true, but it would carry my metaphor a little further than it needs to be carried. Okay, follow-up news from the Department of... So this is what Christian nationalism looks like.
We have that department now?
Yeah, that's a new department. I just established it. It has a staff of 12 and a multi-million-dollar budget, which I don't know where it's coming from. A piece written in the Christian Post last week. It's an opinion piece called "Is This Our Last Chance?" So if you don't know what Christian nationalism looks like in the wild, this is a pretty good example. It starts out, nearly all Christians understand something is off, way off, and that we can no longer confuse God's patience with his approval. Okay. So
are people confusing those two things?
Yeah. If God is not judging us, in the Old Testament sense, he must be fine with everything that we're doing. So, but here's the next line.
Wait, before you go on from that, can I just have you read again the very first part of that sentence?
Something is off, way off. Nearly all Christians understand that something is off.
That's what bothers me. Nearly all Christians.
Well,
all Christians.
You're really going to love the next sentence then. Here's the next sentence, as in the Christian Post. America thinks that she is following God, but she is not.
And nearly all Christians think this?
No, America thinks this.
America thinks it's following God.
First of all, America's a girl.
So, well, clearly, Statue of Liberty, America's a girl's name. It ends in an A. It's all that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. America thinks she is following God, but she is not. We changed our perspective, are drowning in a cesspool of moral filth.
And all Christians recognize that. They're saying that all Christians think that?
Most Christians recognize that something is way off, and the problem is America, as a nation, believes it is following God. We all believe that. Atheists, agnostics, everybody believes, Hindus, we all believe we're following God. We are not, and we are going to get judged because it is offensive to God.
Wait a minute. You can't have it both ways. You can't
What?
argue that America is secularizing and that America believes it's following God.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
one or the other.
sure. Oh, no, it's both. No, we're sinful, but we think we're godly, I think, is what they're saying. Is
Okay.
this another fun quote? Is this our last stand? Is this our last chance? Who knows? I'll let God answer that question. But how do we know that he won't turn and relent from judgment and leave behind a blessing for those who truly know him? So maybe God won't judge America and will instead leave a blessing.
Okay.
Okay.
Did you say who wrote this?
No,
Do you want to say who wrote this?
no.
Okay.
It's a
So
pastor. It's a
can I
pastor
just
who's an opinion contributor for the Christian Post. I just wanted to say, that, hey, this is kind of what confusing America with the children of God looks like in the wild. Yes, Christian?
I was just going to say, from my own life experience, I really think that we, even as Christians following God, confuse blessing with good things. Because as I look over my own life, there are lots of ways that God has blessed me through trial and tribulation. But we in America see God's blessing as, everything good and his punishment as everything bad. And that needs to change.
Or another way of putting it is that we define good and bad based on our cultural values rather than biblical values.
Yes.
Phil, going back to the opening sentences of that article or
Yes.
that opinion piece, if you substitute the word church or substitute church, for America, I think it might work theologically.
The church thinks that she is following God, but she is not. We are drowning in a cesspool of moral filth.
I mean,
Would you make
I
that
don't know if
statement,
that's
Skye?
correct or not, but at least theologically, it's consistent. Whereas it
Mhm.
makes no sense to say America thinks it's following God
Right.
because
Can
I don't know that that's true.
Can I describe to you the cartoon that accompanies the article on the Christian Post?
Did the
Is it a
author make the
cesspool?
cartoon?
No, I don't know. They have a cartoonist. No, it is Uncle Sam in a hospital bed on an IV, wearing his Uncle Sam hat, folding his hands in prayer to the Christian cross that's on the wall in his hospital room.
Now that is Christian nationalism at its best. Or worst, however you want to look at it. Oh, can we move on? What's the next story?
You don't have anything more to say about that. But
Nope.
I built this huge department of people and raised all this money to fund pursuit of, what does Christian nationalism look like in the wild? And I just I'm not sure
Okay. Well,
it's paying
here's my
off.
question that I
Yes.
always ask, and
Yeah.
that is, what can we practically do with this
Oh,
information?
sakes. I haven't funded that department yet. That's the department of what can we practically do. It's just to be aware. It's awareness. We're raising awareness of, hey, this is really bad theology. This is conflating America with the church, America with Israel. It's all sorts of, and it's just illogical. Say America thinks she is following God. Really? Which part of America?
Is there any way we can practically contribute to the conversation in a way that brings awareness to others where we see this operating?
Well, I can tell you how I'm doing it is this week in my daily devotional, we're focusing on the idol of nationalism.
Oh,
Yes.
And in fact,
there you
today, we're
go.
recording this on Monday. I think the one that went out today was about saying America is neither Israel nor the church. So, and that gets to more awareness things. But to your question, Christian, I think in certain communities of Christians, we use America and the church and Israel so interchangeably in our rhetoric that it all just kind of blends together. And so just having more people be aware of it and when appropriate or in a gracious way, kind of going, oh, I think we're confusing our terms here a little bit, or I think we need to be more specific about who a covenant applies to or what really is God up to with his people versus what we might be making assumptions about he's up to with our country. And to do that in a gracious and gentle way and kind of redirect people would be good. But we can't do that if we don't recognize it and have kind of our radar tuned to pick up on this stuff.
Yeah, and I think it is helpful for us to be continually taught and aware of how deep that goes, even in our subconscious or vernacular, for those of us that have grown up in America in the Christian faith, because there are times where I still find it, creeping back in, and I have to check myself. So I do think the conversation is good, Phil. I'm teasing you.
Okay. Yeah. And whenever I read statements like that, I try to swap out America for just a random country around the world. Madagascar thinks she is following God, but she is not. She's drowning in a cesspool of, and she's like, well, that's silly. And, God is going to judge Madagascar if Madagascar doesn't get its act in order. No, we would never say that, because we think that America has a special relationship and is God's chosen nation. And, it's the things we say about America, we wouldn't say about any other country. And we just need to examine that. Why do we say that about America if we wouldn't say it about Canada? Does Canada think she is following God? Did she ever? Is Canada even a she? I don't know. How do I get these questions answered? Is Canada
Canada's clearly a they.
Okay.
I would love to swap out, you always hear that term American exceptionalism.
Yes.
I think we should swap that out for American narcissism.
Oh, okay.
Because that's essentially what it is. It's this centering of the American experience in every way, both in value and quality and superiority. And when you intersect it with Christian theology, we even center it in our theology to say that America is the centerpiece of God's action in the world and his covenants and things, which is, of course, ridiculously bad theology. But that's what American exceptionalism makes us do. And it is a very narcissistic, self-centered, to even imagine Madagascar as the center rather than America is laughable. But we don't laugh about it when it's America, because it's just as laughable biblically to center America as it is Madagascar.
Right. Everyone knows that Costa Rica is really the center of God's will on earth. Yes,
Yeah,
Christian.
I was just going to say, if you put it in a more global perspective, it's extreme ethnocentricity, right? I mean, we really do believe that we are the center of the world, and it begins and ends with us. And I think that the call to some sort of national humility has arrived. It's really time for us to, I think, humble ourselves, not only as a country, but as Christians for sure in this country.
Yeah, here's the one other thing I want to say about this, because the author, defines what our drift, our moral drift. To say we've drifted off course is an understatement. America has completely capitulated. We legalize sin and call it good. We pervert sexuality and call it choice. We mock God and call it freedom. And so that notion that there's a very popular notion that we are worse than we have ever been.
Yeah.
America has never been, we were always a godly country, and now we have rejected God. And I think the blindness to say, okay, there was a point in American history where the economic engine of America was enslaved people that we were horribly mistreating, but God was okay with that. He's not okay with transgenders in bathrooms. That's what he's not okay with. It's this historical blindness where we say that we were pure until the sexual revolution, or until the feminist revolution, and to just completely ignore the immorality of our treatment of non-white Americans for 400 years, because it doesn't fit into the narrative that that we're captivated by right now.
That's also a form of, I guess you could call it generational narcissism, where we center our lived experience without any knowledge of history. So essentially what we're saying is this entire argument of Christian nationalism is rooted in ignorance of the world, ignorance of scripture, ignorance of history, which makes it possible to just look at my very narrow experience in life and time and go, things are worse than I've ever experienced them before, which means in God's eyes, it must be worse than it's ever been. It's just profoundly ignorant.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay, there's a lot going on. Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. That's what it's called pejoratively. Florida calls it the Parental Rights and Education Bill. It bans any instruction on gender and sexuality from grades up through grade 3.
Can I
So,
read the actual line from the bill that's
yes,
causing the problem?
read the
Okay.
line from the bill.
This is a quote. Classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3 or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. So, to break this
Yes,
down, basically, you can't do anything about sexual orientation or gender for grades K through 3, but all the way through high school, you are not allowed to do any instruction on sexuality that's not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate.
right.
But there's no definition given to what those
Right.
things
Okay.
mean.
So let's start by putting it, because people are going to be on both sides of this one.
Hmm.
Let's start by putting it in the most charitable terms. Okay. And then we'll
Okay.
put it in the least charitable terms. Okay. So we'll look at both sides. I think the most charitable terms to put this in is the majority of Americans are part of a traditional faith background, a faith tradition. Most major faith traditions still have a traditional, biblical ethic of sexuality. Most parents that hold to a traditional sexual ethic, biblical sexual ethic, probably don't want their kindergartners being taught by their teacher that their parents' traditional sexual ethic is wrong. Okay. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I also think it's just safe to say most Americans don't want any of their kindergartners taught anything about sex by any teacher.
But that it could be as simple as, do the books that they're reading in kindergarten have only heterosexual couples in them or
Right.
only traditional families in them? Because this would probably ban books that have a same-sex family portrayed.
Yes, but what's interesting about the verbiage of this thing I just read is it could also be interpreted to ban any books with any couples at all. Even
Yeah.
heterosexual couples, because all it says is sexual orientation. Heterosexuality is an orientation. So to show a married couple who are a man and a woman in a story could also technically be banned.
And which
Yeah, but we
lawsuit do you
don't.
think Lucian Greaves is going to file?
Yeah, we don't feel like. I mean, it's even where we say we want prayer in schools, as long as it's our prayer.
Right.
We don't want sexual orientation talked about in schools at
Okay.
kindergarten unless it's our version.
Right.
Okay, so but charitable reading, we think it's inappropriate that the teachers would teach our very young children about sexuality or gender in a way that goes against what we're trying to teach them.
Right. But
Okay,
interestingly, that's not what this says. All it says is sexual orientation or gender identity at all.
yeah,
That means hypothetically, a teacher that says, "Hey, can we separate into boys and girls? Girls on one side of the room, boys on the other," could be a violation of this law
yeah,
because you have to in some way
yes.
instruct what's a boy and a girl.
The less charitable view is to point out the vagaries of the writing. For
There you
example,
go. Being
Right.
less charitable, Skye.
yeah, the preamble to the bill doesn't say instruction, it says discussion. So it's actually internally inconsistent. So banning any discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity could be interpreted to mean that if a child from a same-sex household says, I have two moms, the teacher has to shut that down.
Right.
We cannot discuss that in here, which obviously would have an impact on that child.
Right.
To say your family is so shameful it cannot be even mentioned, and that's part of the distinction between, well, is it the preamble that we're following or is it the actual bill, and why do they say two different things? And the recourse for all of this is that parents can sue the school district, which means school districts really don't want to have to spend millions of dollars in legal fees. So let's just try to avoid anything that could get so the least charitable is this is about chilling conversation about any gender or sexuality issues in
And
school.
making it worse, the bill doesn't only allow parents to sue the school, but forces the school to pay for the parents' legal fees. So
yeah, you
it is definitely meant
really,
to chill. In other words, schools and teachers and administrators don't want to go anywhere near what could potentially trigger a lawsuit. So it chills. I mean,
yeah,
it
yeah,
freezes
and
to
it
absolute
adds
zero the
it
issue.
adds other things like schools would be required to notify parents when children receive mental, emotional, or physical health services at school. So if your child goes into a counselor at school, a guidance counselor, and says, "I'm really struggling with this," that counselor has an obligation to tell the parents, your child came in and this is what he said. That is obviously going to affect what kids are willing to say it's at school to a counselor or a teacher if they're required to report it. And the fear is, obviously, that kids might be confessing that they're wrestling with their gender identity or sexual orientation, and maybe the guidance counselor is encouraging them to explore their sexual orientation without telling the parents. We don't want that. But again, that's the charitable view. The less charitable view is we're going to shut down any honest and open conversation between troubled kids and school staff by sending the message to kids that you can't tell us anything your parents aren't going to find out about.
To also go down that charitable interpretation, Phil, I think as I was reading over stuff about this issue, I think it's a legitimate concern that a lot of families and communities have as we see this massive uptick in children who are questioning their sexual identity, questioning their gender identity, and the culture. I think I understand why a lot of people are anxious about this, and it's a legitimate concern to have. And I think it's also legitimate to say, as a parent, these are deeply formative, important issues that often intersect with values and religion and identity and faith. And I don't want school officials forming those values for my kids. I want to be responsible for that. I think that's all
Right.
incredibly legitimate.
Right.
I'm pretty confident this bill is the wrong answer to a very legitimate concern. And it's a
Mm,
very poorly written law that can be so broadly misunderstood and applied. So, for example, it says, you can only do this at any age. You can only teach these issues in an age appropriate way. Okay. Well, what might be age appropriate in Miami Beach could be very different than what they think is age appropriate in Jacksonville.
right.
Right,
So
and
it's so
parents are gonna
vague.
think what is a parent may have a different idea of what age appropriate is as opposed to a school,
Right.
you know?
We have some Amish parents in our school, and then we have some gay and lesbian parents in our school. I wonder what they think is age appropriate instruction.
Right. Well, and can I bring up one thing that I thought about? I mean, just to play devil's advocate a little bit. I mean,
Yes.
we've never traditionally, as far as I know or I'm aware, and I could totally be wrong about this, but we've never really talked a lot about sexuality and, done intricate health classes in K through 3 anyway.
Right.
That doesn't really start until 5th grade. I mean, I taught school for 10 years, and granted, it was in a private school, but most other teachers I knew, they weren't even talking about that stuff until
Right.
middle school,
I
middle
think
school.
the issue isn't that third graders are going to be taught anything like sex ed. I think the problem is from kindergarten through third grade, as children are encountering just the curriculum and reading storybooks and things like that. If there are depictions of same sex couples or transgender people or something like that, what you're effectively doing is normalizing those identities. And for some people, that's seen as offensive. And they don't want their kids to think that two men or two women married with children and having a family is okay.
Right. Well, have
So
we
that's
ever
what's
have,
being concerned with here.
the only thing that would compare to this again goes back to race when you had people honestly arguing, in some parts of the South that my religion teaches the races must be kept separate. And now the government is wanting to put the races together. This is a huge impasse. And since then, we haven't, for most of American history, Judeo Christian ethics have kind of informed public policy and public ethics. We're definitely at a crossroads where, Judeo Christian ethics, if you hold to a traditional Judeo Christian sexual ethic, you are out of step with public ethics. and how that plays out in public schools and in public settings is going to be increasingly contentious, and will lead more people to homeschooling and more people to private schools. And, if there's lawsuits flying around, more teachers to say, this isn't worth it, I'm out of here, and harder to get teachers. I mean, it's hard enough to teach already, but now try to teach if you aren't sure whether you can acknowledge that Johnny has, two dads in the class when he brings it up. So this is messy. And it's going to get messier. And it's especially messy. Do you know who it's especially messy for? The Walt Disney Company. It's especially messy for the Walt Disney Company right now. They have a new CEO, Bob Chapek is his name, took over for Bob Iger, who was the most successful Disney CEO since Walt. And was beloved by all. Disney has a huge creative community internally, a huge LGBTQ community, and the fan base for the theme parks has a huge LGBTQ community. They do Pride Days every year. They have Pride Mickey Mouse merchandise now in the parks every year. So in general, the Disney company has been seen as an embracer of the LGBTQ community. Until this Don't Say Gay bill came out in Florida, and the Disney company said nothing about it, absolutely nothing, until employees started to go ballistic and staged walkouts at Disney parks saying, we're not going to work because you're not saying anything about this. Pixar employees wrote a letter of protest, a public letter of protest, complaining that the parent company Disney had been editing out same-sex scenes, characters, interactions of the movies for years that Pixar writers had put in. And it exploded all over the new CEO, who just is like, what's happening? So he has had to, and it caused so much internal uproar, he has had to say, we are against this law. We will lobby. He had a call with the governor of Florida to express his concern. The governor of Florida then went public and called him woke. And Disney is a woke corporation that won't listen to the little people. So it's a big old mess. And Steve is walking into the room because he feels like he has a personal stake in this discussion. Steve does, right?
Yes, Steve
right,
wants in on
Skye?
this for sure.
Yeah, and here's the latest. Disney just announced that they have an upcoming movie about Buzz Lightyear called Lightyear. It tells the story of the real Buzz Lightyear. Some friends of mine are working on it. They just announced that they had edited a same-sex kiss out of that movie, and they're now putting it back in. So this will be the first Disney animated movie with a same-sex kiss in it. And because it's now a public thing, this means everyone has time to get ready to protest.
With Disney, I think they're an interesting example because it reminds me a little bit of what's going on in some denominations and churches and Christian higher ed institutions, where Bob Chapek is caught between his employees, a lot of very creative pro-LGBT stuff, and his customers, who are probably skew far more conservative and traditional in their values. And likewise, there are Christian organizations that are caught between their students and some of their faculty, for example, and their donors. And one group is more progressive and one is more conservative. And when you're caught in the middle of that, you go, oh, okay, which constituency do I need to appease to cause the least amount of disruption to my business? And it may not be at all a depiction of the true values of a Bob Chapek or the board at Disney or any institution, as much as it is a desire to keep wanting to make a lot of money. And how do we upset the fewest number of people?
And the other issue Disney has is that if they put same-sex content in a movie, they can't sell it to Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. There are 5 or 6 different countries they can't sell it to. So they have to make an edited version and edit that stuff out. They can have issues in China, which is now the biggest movie market in the world. So he's caught between, I don't want to be Bob Chapek. He's caught between so many constituencies,
Right.
of, and it's not just we want things to be this way, we want things to be that way, but it's competing moral visions of the universe.
Right.
That what you are doing is immoral. And no, what you are doing is immoral, and I'm standing up for what's right. So if everyone is standing up for what's right, It's really hard to figure out how to compromise. Because if you compromise, and to a certain extent, I think the charitable view of the bill in Florida is to say, well, could we compromise where we just agree we're not going to have curriculum that deals with gender identity or sexuality, before fourth grade? You can say that's a compromise because we live in a pluralistic society and we don't all agree on how to present gender or sexuality to second graders. But if you believe that your side of that the other side is immoral, and that to compromise, therefore, is immoral, it's really hard to do that. And you just end up everyone pulling their kids out, in homeschooling because we can't agree.
I was wondering about this when I read that article about the school, the Don't Say Gay bill, and thought, well, why can't they just treat this the way they do prayer or religion, where we just say, hey, this is not the domain of the public schools, and leave it to families and communities to do it on their own. The school shouldn't be involved. You can do that with something like religion and prayer. It's a lot harder to do that with
family
sexual
structure
identity and family structure. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because what happens when little Jimmy says, my two dads are coming to the Halloween, costume party thing at school, and you're like, well, we can't talk about that because it violates some policy. So there, I fear what's going to happen here is similar to what happened with racial integration many generations ago, or back in like the 1960s in the South, is a bunch of Christians decided we're not on board with this, and they're going to pull their kids out and create their, back then it was segregation academies. Now it's going to be, I don't know, traditional marriage academies or something. And the side effect of that will be a whole nother generation of Christians will be withdrawn from the public square, ill-equipped to deal with how to live out their faith in a pluralistic society that doesn't entirely agree with them, and just cede more territory to forces and ideas and values that have that aren't tethered to traditional Christian faith at all. And I think that would be a terrible response. And it also wouldn't give Christians the opportunity to practice humility and graciousness and learning and a lot of the common grace that could come from remaining engaged with people who disagree with you.
Yeah, I think we do have to be able to argue on some level that this is not exactly analog to the race debate of 50 years ago. Because they're like the state of Mississippi would not air Sesame Street for the first year that it was on. And their response was the people of Mississippi are not ready to see black and white Americans living together on the same street.
Or Birds and Monsters.
As they do on Sesame Street. And then by the second year, they decided, no, okay, we think maybe we're okay with it now. But if this is that, then it's, how can you stand against it? You have to say this is different because it is different. And that's all I have to say about that. Christian.
I was going to say about Mississippi, you have to realize that the schools weren't actually integrated until I was in 8th grade. So that was like 1978 as it was. And I think, Sesame Street came out in the 60s. But one question that I had that's sort of intertwined with this issue is, the issues that we've been talking about bathroom use, male and female bathroom use, and sort of what those requirements are. And I started thinking about, what if there are teachers that in the Florida schools, in the elementary level, or really anywhere, and they are homosexual, and they have a spouse of the same sex, then they're sort of forced into hiding, in a sense, based and probably living afraid that, what is this new world that I'm living in?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead, Skye.
This whole thing, though, fits this. We've talked about it over the years, but this larger dilemma that we increasingly live in a society where the most basic definitions are no longer shared, right? We don't share a common assumed definition of what marriage is. We don't even no longer assume a shared definition of what it means to be male and female. And that's what's different, I think, right now than during the civil rights movement. And honestly, I don't know how a pluralistic society like ours goes forward in relative harmony when we don't even share those basic ideals. And that's what's a little bit frightening to me about this moment. You can't,
Right.
no society can hold together without some shared ideals. And when the most basic ones are no longer shared, it's going to be very chaotic and ugly, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hope we need to wrap up because we're out of time. We're over time. But I hope you can all understand that what we're not trying to do is say this is right and this is wrong, and you have to agree with us or you're wrong, because we're right. And rather say, let's look at what arguments people are making and what people are doing. And then let's look at, what's the most charitable way to look at this, and then what's a less charitable way to look at this. So we can try to understand both sides of these issues because they're really, really tough and they're not going to get easier. Okay, thanks for coming along. You're going to wish we could go back to episode 500 and just sing silly songs about evangelicals. But no, there's more stuff happening, and we need to talk about all of it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. Thanks for being there for us last week. It was a really fun episode. And we'll be back next week with more news, but don't miss the interview that's coming up. Okay, thanks, guys. See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
The Holy Post podcast is funded by listeners like you who support us on Patreon. This episode is also supported by Abide, the #1 Christian meditation app. Do you get anxious? Have a hard time calming down? It's hard to calm down just by telling yourself to calm down, like telling yourself not to think about elephants. See, you're thinking about elephants. That's why lots of people are turning to meditation apps. But what are you meditating on? Fill your mind with the Bible with the Abide meditation app. Abide users report less stress, lower levels of anxiety and depression, and better sleep. And for a limited time, listeners of the Holy Post will get 25% off a premium subscription when you visit abide.co/holypost. So get started now with 25% off a premium subscription by downloading the Abide app. You'll get additional stories and meditations, premium music, soothing sounds, and more. Support the Holy Post and get 25% off by going to abide.co/holypost. That's abide.co/holypost to download the Abide app and get 25% off your premium subscription. And now, back to the show.
My guest today is my friend Reverend Dr. Gabriel Salguero. He's the pastor of The Gathering Place, a Latino-led multi-ethnic Assemblies of God congregation in Orlando, Florida. He's also the president and founder of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, a national coalition of several thousand evangelical congregations in the U.S. I've asked him to come on the show not because he has a new book or some other project that he's promoting, but simply to inform our audience about the reality and impact that Latino evangelicals are having in the American church. As you know, we talk a lot about white evangelicalism on this podcast, and sometimes we talk about the African American church. But we don't talk enough about the Latino church in America. And as you'll hear in our conversation, too often Latino evangelicals are just invisible. And yet, demographically, they really represent a significant portion of the future of the church in America that we need to be paying more attention to. So I'm incredibly grateful that Gabriel agreed to come on the show and talk about his experience and the diverse experiences of evangelicals in the Latino community in America. Here is my conversation with Gabriel Salguero. Gabriel Salguero, welcome to the Holy Post.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to have you here. We've always had great conversations, but we've never recorded them. So I'm hoping that this ends up being even a fraction as interesting as our other ones.
Me too. I'm excited and nervous about what's coming down.
This is not a gotcha interview. I'm not here to, ruin your life or ministry.
Thanks.
So to start off with, I just think it'd be great for our audience to know more about your story and your background. And we can't get into all the minutiae, which you and I have talked about before, but give us kind of the broad brushstrokes of your story and how you've come to be a pastor in Orlando and your role now. But give us a little bit of your journey.
Yeah, so I was born in New Jersey. I'm a Jersey Shore boy. I'm one of the 2/3 of Latinos that are U.S. born. And so both my parents have been pastors for 41 years in New Jersey. So I'm a Jersey Rican. That means Puerto Rican and New Jersey. Happily married to Jeanette for the last 20 years. And I have 2 boys, John Gabriel and Seth. And now I'm in Orlando, Florida. So most of my life I lived in New Jersey. I pastored in New York City, in Manhattan, a multi-ethnic church, Latino-led multi-ethnic church. Worshipped in English, Spanish, and Mandarin because it was in Chinatown. It was quite a challenge. And then for the last 6 years, I've been here in Orlando, Florida, and Jeanette and I co-lead pastor the Gathering Place, which is a Latino-led multi-ethnic Assemblies of God church. So I'm an Assemblies of God minister. As you know, and we've talked a lot about this, I'm the president and founder of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, which is a representative voice for Hispanic evangelicals in the United States. There are about 9 or 10 million Hispanic evangelicals living in the United States. You know, Skye, that brown evangelicals are the fastest growing segment of evangelicals in the United States. And so we seek in our network, it's a network of networks to empower the Latino church, both internally in church health, church planting, leadership development, spiritual formation, and externally, speaking with the Latino Evangelical Church on issues of public policy and the common good.
Yeah, so one of the ways we first engaged one another was at some meetings that gathered different evangelical leaders together, and you have an important role as a bridge between the Latino evangelical community and other evangelical communities, especially the majority white evangelical community. And so you've, for me, sort of been a whisperer, helping me understand some of the differences in dynamics because I have no background or experience. Despite being brown, I don't have any experience in the Latino church. Share some of your experience in what differentiates Latino evangelical experience in America from what a white evangelical might have experienced.
Well, man, that is a very loaded and heavy question, but I
It's a
think
big
that,
one.
yeah, I think that first of all, we have different social realities and contexts from which and to which we minister. And so I think that informs some of our pastoral positions, some of our policy positions, some of our responses to issues in the public sphere. And so context matters, and sometimes when Skye, you see evangelicals say, or evangelicals have said this or that or the other thing, they really mean white evangelicals.
Right.
So sometimes we feel like what Ralph Ellison has called the invisible man, right? Latino evangelicals are the kind of invisible segment of evangelicalism in America, even though we're the fastest growing. And so that's, there's an invisibility. I think that's different. I also think that we tend to be, although we are socially conservative like white evangelicals for the most part, on a host of issues, we lean different from our white evangelical brothers and sisters. And so, what I would say to most people is, when you're engaging Latino evangelicals, is realize there are some commonalities, but there are some historical, social, cultural differences that inform and form how we speak. I do think that we pursue to be gospel centered. We seek to transform culture and to make our contribution, but if there's anything we need to continue to say, who to whoever would listen, is that evangelicals are not a monolith. We are not a monolith. And when you say evangelical or evangelical or brown evangelical, even among us, we're not even Latino evangelicals are a monolith. There's a great diversity.
Some of that comes from the fact that white evangelicalism it's centered in power, right?
Mhm.
It has had a lot of cultural, political, economic power historically, whereas Latino evangelicals and other non-white evangelical groups are on the periphery more often. How is that difference in position? And you mentioned there's a lot of shared values around social conservatism, but other policy issues look very different. And I think it's not just because you're Latino, it's because you're Latino and on the margin rather than at the center of power. What does that look like?
I think one of the best phrases to capture it comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his Letters and Papers from Prison. The view from below. Right? The view from below is different. And so, although we share the gospel and we have a common gospel and a common core conviction, so I think that context matters. And so, historically, we make less money. We're situated in more urban centers. And so, issues like criminal justice reform, policing, racial reconciliation and justice from a biblical perspective are deeply informed by the context in which we serve and the communities which we serve. And so many of us have been doing prison ministry for years. Many of us have been doing community outreach and serving in food pantries. So that informs how we see economic policy, and how we see wealth, and how we see income and salaries and just salaries. And so one of the challenges has been to dig deeper into the realities of Hispanics in America. Think about this. One out of every four kids born in the US is Hispanic. One out of every two is a child of color. So there's 62.5 million Latinos in the United States. 62.5 million, according to the last census. If we were a Spanish-speaking country only, we would be the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, second only to Mexico. So it's a major group of people with shared realities around a whole host of issues that have often not been the bread and butter issues for white evangelicalism.
Okay, let's talk about some of the commonalities, and this may sound kind of negative, but I'd like to talk about the shared problems that we are seeing. There's been a lot of focus in recent years on the brokenness that has existed within many white evangelical systems around leadership, abuse, sexual abuse, power, things that. Where do you see that similar dynamic in the Latino evangelical church, or has it been in some way protected or shielded from those dynamics by not being at the center of power?
No, look, I think our humanity lurks, right? And I think that we share the same brokenness. There's stories, tragic, lamentable stories of abuse of power. We have mega churches in the Latino community. Some of the largest churches in America are Hispanic evangelical, Hispanic Pentecostal churches. And so, you know, as Lord Acton would say, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So we have some of that. I think the truth is that we also have the challenge of secularization, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's what people don't know: that the longer Latinos live in the United States, the more secular they become, because as we become Americanized, we become secularized, right? Charles Taylor and the secular age and that
Yep.
secular thesis. So we have the challenge that our millennials and our Gen Zs are becoming more and more secularized, and so that's one of our challenges. But the issues of abuse, the issues of how women are treated in the structures of power of Hispanic evangelicalism, is a real challenge that can't go. My wife, Jeanette, works with Christine Kane on a whole host of issues. And they often talk about the similarities in, kind of white evangelicals and brown evangelicalism, of the disempowerment and disenfranchisement of powerful women's voices. And so, as it is true in the larger evangelical world, so it is true in our world. I think, we've also seen fiscal challenges, right? Economic abuse. And so all of that is real in our community.
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic where on the extreme conservative end of the spectrum in white America, there can be a monolithic negative view of immigrants and minorities. And on the extreme progressive end of it, there can be a romanticizing of immigrants and people of color. And even within the church, where I've seen this, white Christians lamenting what's going on in white evangelicalism, who romanticize, well, the black church has it right, or the Latino church has it right. Like, well, calm down. Yeah, there's some things there that we need to learn from, but they have their own challenges. And like you said, we're all human, and power corrupts. And so we got to be careful not to over romanticize some of these things.
Yeah, look, I think that's the sin of making the other exotic.
Right.
You either romanticize him or her, or you vilify them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And both of them, I think, are the sins of considering them exotic or strange or other, right? And neither is a true depiction.
Right.
Every community, everyone has its strengths and its foils, and I think we have to embrace that. Look, I am proud to be a Hispanic evangelical. I'm one of these evangelicals that does not want to give up on the word evangelicalism. Uh, One reason is because now, as we are claiming it, and as more and more Latinos are claiming evangelicalism, our white brothers and sisters want to let it go. And
Yeah.
I'm like, the timing, I don't think is right for us to abandon it. I think we can redefine it. I think we can revitalize it. I was reading David Brooks' article in the New York
Yep.
Times this week about this kind of, I don't know, renewal, revitalization, resistance. There, people use different languages, and it's interesting. He mentioned many white evangelicals and many African American evangelicals and some Asian Americans. He did not mention any Hispanic
Hmm.
evangelicals as, and David's a good friend, and we have good relationship. It is continue that invisibility of the largest and probably most influential group of Hispanic evangelicals going down. Here's something interesting, Skye. A lot of Hispanic evangelicals can determine the future of the American political landscape because we live in quintessential swing states
Right.
and we are the quintessential swing voter. About 40% of us are registered non-party or affiliated or independent. And from election to election, there are swings on that. And so I think it behooves sociologists and church planters and strategists and denominations to really look at this group more closely and what it portends for the future of evangelicalism in America. If there
Yeah.
is
So,
to be one. If there is to be one.
right. And that's the conundrum. And this is the part that I find so disturbing and perplexing. There, there, for years, I've been seeing like the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, has admitted that they're declining, except among Latino congregations and churches. A number of other denominations have affirmed that the future of the church in America has to be more brown. And so, just as that data is coming to light and people are realizing this, a lot of white evangelicals take a very negative view of immigration, a negative view of racial minorities. They politically entrench themselves in Christian nationalism and whether explicit or implicit racist policies. So it feels like the white church in America, the evangelical white church in America, knows that the brown community is its future, while at the same time building a wall, figuratively speaking, to keep those Christians out of their communities and out of their leadership and out of their future. So how have you reconciled that in your head that all the data backs what you're saying, but the posture seems to be the opposite? It's self-defeating, but that's where we are.
Look, Aristotle says something that might be helpful to us. It's called the law of kind of double effect, right? Nothing prevents two things, which may be opposites, for being true at the same time, especially in our perceptions, right? And so while a lot of people are saying, and there are a lot of it, Latino church planting initiatives, for example, there are
Hmm.
Latino leadership cohorts in many denominations. I was just at a national meeting of Hispanic leaders with a very well-known national ministry talking about Hispanic initiatives, and they've been saying it for over a decade. So you can say the future is this, but you can also say, I'm not sure what that future is going to look like, because one thing is to have people at the table. The other thing is for that group to determine what's going to be served for dinner.
Hmm.
And so I think that there's some trepidation, and it is because of proximity. Because a lot of people know about Latino evangelicals, but they may not know a Latino evangelical. They may not be in a personal relationship with a Latina or Latino evangelical. So what they know are these kind of idealized stories and narratives from all the political extremes about this community. I think that as this group continues to grow, there is the next challenge. If we're going to really integrate Hispanics, Latinos, Latinas into the future of evangelicalism, is proximity, to know their stories, to actually sit and listen to what is the history. I mean, this history is not 5 years old or 10 years old. Hispanic evangelicals have been here, you know, since the dawn of of the American nation. And so we obviously was they're Latino Christians. Evangelicalism is a much more later construct, but we've always contributed to this. And I think what needs to happen is, instead of kind of stories about them, is to hear the stories from them and from us, so that we can speak for ourselves then rather than to be brokered by other groups.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like some of these institutions, ministries, denominations, whatever, they understand that their future and survival depends upon engaging with Latino evangelicals, planting those churches, engaging those communities, but it's not out of self-interest. Like, this is necessary for our survival, but it doesn't feel like there's actual affinity for and desire to genuinely partner with those leaders and give them more of a say at the table. Rather, it's a necessity rather than a desire.
Yeah,
And
and
if
look,
the,
I think I've seen both. I've seen people
Mhm.
who want genuine partnership because they have been in relationship with Latino and Latina evangelical leaders and laity and congregations, and then I've seen other people who've kind of seen the proverbial handwriting on the wall, right? The writing on the wall, saying, "Oh my goodness, if we don't do anything, what will become of us?" So they're seeking kind of a an alliance of convenience
Right.
rather than a deep relationship. So I've seen both. I've seen both. Where I've seen most fruitfulness is where people have actually not just invited people in, but celebrated their contributions
Hmm.
and have asked, what can we learn from each other, right? Look, Hispanic evangelicals have something to teach, but we have something to learn, right? Every community has something to teach and something to learn. One of the challenges we Hispanic evangelicals, a caution I have is we don't necessarily need to replicate and clone everything white evangelicalism has done.
Hmm.
Um, we can contribute some renewal, some reformation to what's happening in evangelicalism. Think about the late 40s and early 50s, the kind of heyday of white evangelicalism in America, and the institution building that happened. Right, Gordon Conwell Seminary, Fuller, Christianity Today, Wheaton, all of the great influence of Billy Graham and Harold Ockenga and so many. I think we're living that moment in Hispanic evangelicalism right now.
So
That we're building
give some
institutions.
examples. What are some of the developments that you think are emerging from that community that have a long future, perhaps in shaping the church here?
I'll give you a few. Number one, there's indigenous institutions being developed that allow Latino evangelicals to speak for themselves on issues of public policy, on
Hmm.
issues of culture. I think that there are indigenous leaders leading multi-ethnic movements. Think about World Vision. The new president of World Vision is Hispanic, and that's not a small thing. And so that many Latino leaders and Latina leaders are leading multi-ethnic institutions in evangelicalism. So there's the development of Latino evangelical institutions. There's the leadership by Latinos in historical um, evangelical institutions, either as their president or CEO, whoever he or she may be, or as part of boards. I'm part of the board of the National Association of Evangelicals, and increasingly that has become more diverse with a
Hmm.
new president who's Asian American, and so that's part of that. I also think that there's continued publication, right? That there's a contribution to the theological and cultural reflections since the days of people like René Padilla, Ruth Padilla de Boers, Samuel Escobar, people like that. That they're Tim Keller says that part of the renewal will be renewing the kind of mind of the evangelical mind. Well, some of those contributions come from very thoughtful and deeply grounded Hispanic evangelicals who are not just kind of ghettoized or marginalized into, oh, you want to learn about Latino evangelicalism? Read that. No, they're contributing to the larger conversation. So there's an intellectual contribution, there's an institutional contribution. On top of that, there's a demographic boom of church planting and healthy church models. So those contributions, I think, are at least creating an awakening amongst evangelicalisms that Latino evangelicalism is not just a kind of footnote, but should be an essential part of forming the DNA, the cultural DNA, the future, the missional DNA of evangelicalism in America. Let's be clear. Global evangelical is predominantly Asian, African American, and Hispanic. And so, if the US evangelicalism wants deeper ties to global evangelicalism, they need to work more closely with the evangelicals of color in the United States, in Canada, and the rest of North America.
Absolutely. You referenced the David Brooks article in the New York Times recently. And it was an interesting article, and you're right, he didn't feature any Latino leaders. But let me ask you this. The article was essentially saying that white evangelicalism has been torn asunder in recent years by political division, debates over COVID, debates over race. And I think he opened the article saying, imagine you have 12 super close friends and suddenly discover that you find 6 of their views abhorrent and they find your views abhorrent, and there's this shocking division that occurs. Um, there are a lot of white evangelical communities, churches, institutions that are feeling that tearing apart because of politics and COVID and race, all these things. What contribution do you think that Latino evangelical leaders like yourself and others would be making had they had more of a seat at the table in these tumultuous times? Um, are you seeing things even in your own church around these issues that you feel equipped differently to deal with it because of your theological, cultural dynamics that a white church may not? What can we learn from how you're navigating these things?
Well, first, I want to confess that our community is not immune to the polarization.
Mm-hmm.
That those seeds of polarization and and tension and sometimes conflict is real. But what I do think is that because Latinos, like any other community, are so diverse. Let me give you an example. Cubans in southern Florida, Puerto Ricans in New York, Mexican Americans in El Paso, Texas, or California, Salvadorians in Washington, D.C. and Virginia, Dominicans in North Carolina or New York City and the Heights, right? I could go on.
Yeah.
Already, Venezuelans arriving to Central Florida because of the Venezuelan crisis. Already, we have to navigate in our churches different histories and, quite frankly, different political, different ideological genealogies. That as a pastor, you have to live that every day. And so there is a type of kind of implicit discipleship and catechesis. There is a discipleship happening saying, sisters and brothers, we have to learn, number one, to value truth and honesty, but we also have to learn how to value civility and difference, right? And so, because of the heterogeneous nature of Hispanicity in America, because of immigration and U.S. born Hispanics, we have long been dealing with these tensions. And the pastoral and spiritual formation track of teaching us the tools of uh, when Peter and Paul have a strong dispute, how to do it in a gospel centered way that does not balkanize the church. I think that is a contribution that we are able to bring, and we have brought because we seek to be bridge builders. Now, here's the thing. Here's the right. The AND campaign often talks about both civility and courage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you're a hybrid like us, right? So when I go into a room, they were like, Gabriel Salguero, an evangelical leader, automatically the assumption is I am a conservative, Republican, I have certain views on politics and culture, right? If I go into another room and they say, Gabriel Salguero, a Latino leader, there's all of these assumptions of he's a Democrat, he's a liberal, he voted for such and such, right? But because we live in the hybridity of I am a Latino and an evangelical, right? We have strong ties to the evangelical community and strong ties to the Latino community. That has helped us create an integrated discipleship that we hope at our best is gospel centered, that is committed to the gospel above denominationalism or evangelicalism, right? And above kind of ethnocentrism or cultural superiority. Because we have lived in the nexus, and that's not just true of Latino evangelicals. I'm sure it's of Asian evangelicals, African American, First
Mm-hmm.
Nation. Anyone who lives in the hybrid has, W.E.B. Du Bois calls it double consciousness in Souls of Black Folk.
Right.
One of our great Latino evangelical Pentecostal thinkers, Eldin Villafaña, says Hispanics have triple consciousness because we are Latino, we are European, we are African, and so since it's really part of our history, we have learned to develop a discipleship that tries to reconcile both civility and truth. Oftentimes, if we create an idol of our tribe, whether it's evangelicalism or Hispanicity, we will put the accent on one or the other.
It's a great reminder of the immense diversity that exists under the label that we just call Hispanic or Latino. It's an incredibly diverse group of communities in the United States and within the church, and that's a great reminder. And there's been research that has shown that even a little bit of diversity in a community, whether it's not just ethnic diversity or cultural diversity, but any kind of recognizable diversity, immediately results in a ability to see multiple perspectives. Whereas if it's a homogenous group, you just lock in that this is what it means to be Christian, or this is what it means to be evangelical, or whatever. That's a hugely important reminder. Earlier, you mentioned the dynamic that uh, when you get to generation 2 or 3 of an immigrant experience, there's a secularization that happens in the United States. Certainly not just true of Latino immigrants, but I mean, Asian immigrants, my family's from South Asia, there's an assimilation that just naturally occurs culturally. But the other end of that is there is a dynamic that newer immigrants that come into the United States tend to have stronger Christian identity, values, and belief. How have you navigated all the rhetoric in recent years, the anti-immigrant rhetoric in recent years, coming from certain segments of the church, when you know and I know that these immigrants they're bringing new life into the church and new vitality of faith in a way that indigenous Americans, second, third, fourth generation, are not. What's your message to those people that are fighting on that front?
Look, I tell people, get to know us. Listen to our stories. Um, Listen to our deepest held values. What is it that we hold most dear? Look at our families. Visit our worship spaces. Look at our contributions, right? I think that some people say proximity breeds contempt. Maybe in our case, proximity will breed respect,
Mm-hmm.
admiration. And so I'm going to just tell you the truth. It breaks my heart when I hear these kind of xenophobic tropes. These are your brothers and sisters in Christ, created in the image of God, for whom Christ died. Either you remember Chris Rock. He was the first black president. You might remember in that movie Head of State, right? It just predates the first African American president in history, right? And when he's running for office in this movie, he used to say this phrase, "God bless America and nobody else, and nobody else." Right? Think about it. It's Chris Rock running as the first black president in the movie,
Right.
and his trope is ethnocentric nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is the problem, that somehow we have lost the gospel of John 3. For God so loved the world
Mm-hmm.
that God gave God's only son. That somehow gospel centrality has been co-opted, has been misaligned with nationalism and idolatry. Look, and I've seen this in other places around the world. I've traveled to Brazil where we see some of that and some of the suffering of some indigenous persons in Brazil. I've seen it in Honduras. And so that's kind of human impulse for superiority, that the gospel always tells us this is not the way of the cross. The way of the cross is we exist for others. We give our lives for others. No greater love has a person than this, than they give their life for the other. And some of that is based on fear, right? I read Samuel Huntington's book, not The Clash of Civilizations. That's the one that's known the best.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a book, Who Are We? Huntington wrote a book. And it's about how he understands America to be. And his thesis is that America is a nation of settlers, and that Hispanics are a threat to that because we refuse to settle, right? And so what we have to, I think, challenge ourselves is to hear the gospel anew, hear it again. I'm a Trekkie. I don't know about you, Skye. I mean, I like Star Wars too, but there's a trope in Star Trek about the Borg, right? The
Right.
Borg assimilates everything. And that, you know what the phrase is? Resistance is futile.
Right.
The gospel does not call us to assimilate. There are Jews and Gentiles in the gospel, bond and free, male and female, rich and poor, highly educated and illiterate. The gospel is not a call to assimilation. The gospel is a call to integration. And that, right? And some people quote Dr. King, the most segregated. I don't know. Dr. King never had a vision of assimilation. He had a vision of integration.
Right.
It's Revelation 7:9. Even in the eschaton, we don't stop being different. John saw us. from every tribe, nation, and tongue. If John saw this in the end of days, that means those differences were noticeable. And difference is not something to be feared, it's to be celebrated. Because, Skye, here's the issue: difference is not a product of the fall. Difference didn't happen because of sin in humanity. The trees were different in creation. The angels were different in creation. Male and female were different in creation. And somehow, this terrible theology that difference necessarily means uh, separation, hostility, no. And that's the gospel we need to preach again. That moves us away from ethnocentrism and national idolatry.
So what do you do then, and to play devil's advocate a little bit, what do you do with the person who says, okay, I'm with you. Difference is God ordained and it's good and it should be celebrated. And in order to preserve that difference, we should be separate. Because if we blend, if we come together, if we share one congregation, for example, it could dilute those differences, which ought to be distinct and celebrated.
That's a great question, because that coin has another side. The gospel is difference and unity. Right? When we sing that old hymn, in Christ there is no east nor west, right? So it's not uniformity, but it is unity. We are all members of one body. We belong to each other. What hurts you should hurt me. Paul's very explicit. If one member of the body hurts, even if that's an immigrant, a racial minority, or J.D. Vance when he's talking about hillbilly elegy and poor whites in Appalachia, that should hurt me. That poor white children are drinking Mountain Dew from a bottle that rots their teeth. That should matter to me, because I think that's a problem of the deficiency of much of modern evangelical. The scandal of the evangelical mind is that we don't have one. That's the running joke. It's that we can't embrace paradox.
Yes.
Right? Hey, I am unified with my wife, but I am not my wife. So difference and unity they are not polar opposites. This is the beauty of the gospel, that God out of two people, right? In Galatians, and God made out of two people one people, but they were still Jews and they were still Greeks and Gentilium, and right. And so the reality is, when you come to Christ, you don't stop being black. You don't stop being Asian or Latino. You don't stop being a male, or you don't stop being a female. But you do join a larger body, and you realize that there are things I have to put at the feet of the cross for the health of the larger community of saints. And so, if people think that diversity is the opposite of unity, they've not understood the day of Pentecost. They all spoke in different tongues, but they were the church.
Right. Okay, last question, because we're running out of time. Not in a eschatological or cosmic sense, but in a shorter term and more earthly sense, what gives you hope? What do you look at and you go, okay, there's potential here for something really good and beautiful and true to emerge in the American church? What do you see?
Multiracial marriages. Beautiful children coming from integrated families. Right? If the core of humankind is the family, this is a sign of the kingdom breaking in.
Well, it's interesting because that's the fastest growing demographic in America based on the new census data. It's mixed race kids.
Yeah, that's not to say that my family, I married a Latino woman, that the kingdom is not breaking in homogenous families.
In my view, every marriage on some level is a cross-cultural marriage.
That's right. That is absolutely right.
Yeah.
But I think that gives us multi-ethnic congregations and multicultural congregations. The rise of leaders of color in historical institutions that would not have accepted them maybe decades and decades ago. And look, Zechariah says we are prisoners of hope. We, the exiles, are prisoners of hope because God sings songs over us. At the end of the day, it's maybe it's Pollyanna, but it's my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus Christ and his righteousness. On Christ, the solid rock, we stand. All other ground, political ground, ideological ground, is sinking sand. And so I'm Christ-centered, and the resurrection gives me hope. I am a true believer that Christ died and resurrected, and because Christ rose, the church will survive. The world is being made new over and over again. And so, but I see it every day. I also see it in racial reconciliation moments where people have awakened and have actually repented for something they've done. And there are a lot of what is it that Philip Yancey says, where the light falls? There's a lot of
Hmm.
places the light is falling. It's like, Aslan está moviéndose. Aslan se está moviendo, hermano. Aslan is on the move. The
Hmm.
winter witch could blow winter, but Aslan is on the move.
Amen. Amen. Gabriel, thank you so much for your time and for your leadership. And I look forward to the next time we get to talk and work on something together, because I always enjoy it thoroughly.
You're awesome, with a capital A, as my kids would say. Praying for you and praying that this podcast blesses so many people.
Great. Thank you so much.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.